Sybil Stockdale was an accidental activist. She never believed political efficacy would do her any good until it did. As the wife of U.S. Navy pilot James Stockdale, she was expected to sit at home, sit tight, and raise her kids while her husband fought in the Vietnam War. She didn't feel that she could be effective, yet when it came down to it, she was effective in petitioning the government. When her husband was shot down over North Vietnam in 1965, she had no idea if he was dead or alive, and when she found out he was a prisoner of war, she was told by the government to keep quiet about her missing husband and his possible mistreatment, because if the enemy knew that the U.S. knew, they would treat the prisoners worse. But did she follow that edict? No. No, she did not. She defied the government and banded together with her local support group, then decided to go national and formed the National League of Families of American Prisoners and the Missing in Southeast Asia. She was the first national coordinator, and within a year, she was in Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird's office discussing policy. When the Nixon administration ended the keep quiet policy and allegations of torture of U.S. prisoners became fully public, Sybil was the main spokeswoman advocating for their return. According to the customs of the time, even though she had the right to vote, Sybil was average. She kept her head low, and she was expected to remain stalwart and unquestioning of national loyalty. She at first wasn't taken seriously, and perhaps her sense of political efficacy was low. But once she found an issue that couldn't be ignored, through persistence, she petitioned for change in the government, and she succeeded. Sounds pretty effective to me. I mentioned political efficacy at the very beginning of this speech. You may wonder, what is political efficacy? If you had asked me this question 2 or 3 years ago, I would have given you a blank stare and something like, oh, I don't know, what is it? Oh, to be a young, naive freshman again. It's generally defined as the sense that a person's vote makes a difference. Another source defines it as feeling that political and social change is possible and that the individual citizen can play a part in bringing about this change. And not only is political efficacy a highly specific yet very general term, there are 2 types of political efficacy. Internal efficacy, or the belief that one can understand politics and therefore participate in them, and external efficacy, or the belief that the government will respond to one's demands. Political efficacy is much more than voting. It is the emotional reasoning behind voting and encompasses all other civic participation, from phone banking and campaigning to fundraising and running for office. Women vote in higher numbers than men. That much has been true for the past 2 election cycles at least. In every U.S. presidential election dating back to 1984, women reported having turned out to vote at slightly higher rates than men, according to an analysis of the Census Bureau data by the Pew Research Center. But in most other areas of political participation, women are not nearly as effective, and I wanted to know why. In most political actions, women are doing well. The problem then lies further within the mind, with women's pressures to be politically effective in some ways, yet not politically effective in others, still weighing on them far more than the act of voting ever will. I believe a passage from an article from the Center of American Women on Politics most aptly sums up the factors. It is as follows. Women are more likely to vote than men, but gender gaps persist in many other forms of political engagement. Women tend to be less interested in current events, less knowledgeable about partisan politics than men, and less likely to participate in a number of campaign acts beyond voting. The origins of these gender gaps are partially rooted in gendered patterns of socialization. Men and women tend to differ in their feelings of self-confidence, where confidence and assertiveness tend to be valued as masculine traits rather than feminine. This is important for politics, as self-confidence is associated with higher levels of political interest and efficacy among both men and women. But because it is a psychological research that men are more likely to possess than women, gender differences in self-confidence can contribute to gender gaps in engagement in politics. Another example is orientations towards conflict. Women are often perceived as being less tolerant of conflict and disagreement compared to men. End of passage. I've even seen this in my own life. My mother, who is not nearly as vocally engaged in politics as me or my dad are, is an example of this. I suppose it's a matter of generation. I'm Gen Z, she's Gen X. And Gen Z, at least as far as I've seen, is quite politically active, is on the forefront of every social media post you see, of every leading initiative, and we can see that all over there. But my mom is so busy that she doesn't engage or talk about the news unless we talk to her. She's quiet, and that's part of her personality, of course, but that's what's been expected of mothers, of grown women. She fairly fits the bill of less interested in current events, less knowledgeable about partisan politics, and less likely to participate beyond voting. I know there are other mothers and daughters and sisters who act the same way as a result of these gendered patterns of socialization. I conducted an online survey in the past few weeks to understand the point of view of my peers as to how politically effective they felt. For the most part, on a 1 to 10 scale, my female and non-binary peers responded that the power of their influence on the institutions that they were a part of was above a 5, but when further questioned, they reported that they didn't feel they had a sense of political efficacy because they were either too young, or their vote was too small, or that they were part of a marginalized group. No matter how effective they should be, they struggled to believe that the institutions were truly willing to bend for them. Most respondents, regardless of their political leanings, didn't trust the government very much because of the previously listed reasons. I find these surprising, yet not surprising. The whole thing about being too young, I get it, but a working democracy involves all citizens, regardless of age. There are currently 24 women in the Senate, down from a record 26 in 2020. Women are 56% of the population, but only 20% of the Senate. Women are getting elected to office more and more often, but there are still few numbers of women of color getting elected to office. Women of color are barred from entry into the political ranks due to a number of things, most chiefly their race, but also age, education, and so on. And we know this isn't true according to existing law now, which bans discrimination, but it's more of the invisible factors. Negative stereotypes of the types that women of color are not fit to serve office are outdated and proven untrue over and over again. That is another issue in and of itself. For example, the current session of Congress began with a historic high of 26 black women out of 535 voting members. A record 9 black women currently serve as mayors of the country's largest 100 cities. And this year, Kamala Harris became the country's first woman, first black, and first Asian vice president. But black women have faced harassment and death threats beyond this job description, like Baltimore State Attorney Marilyn Mosby. She was one of several prosecutors around the country considered to be more progressive for their promises to reform the system when elected. But she immediately had to deal with people doubting her abilities, despite graduating from a top law school and working with the state attorney right out of college. During her first term, she had to deal with prosecuting the death of Freddie Gray at the hands of police officers. When she started to file charges, she began receiving death threats. 6 years later, they haven't stopped, even after 3 of the officers were acquitted and the charges against the remaining officers were dropped. This particular example, tied with the common thread of other women of color receiving similar harassment and doubt, is a reason why political efficacy is lower among women. We, as young women, are told to look up to strong role models. There are strong political figures that are female, more than previous generations, but inequity that persists means we only have 1 Speaker of the House, 1 Vice President, and a smaller portion of elected officials than the actual a smaller portion of elected officials than the actual population to represent women across the country, rather than having had multiple diverse officials to represent women over the long course of American history. Ultimately, women struggle in these areas of political efficacy because of the underlying reason of gendered societal expectations. Women have the expectation to fulfill of usually being a good housewife, of raising children, of being kind and nurturing, and of being fairly submissive to authority, no matter the culture. Currently, women are all expected to do all this, but also support the family by having a good job. There are so many responsibilities to be managed that for most women, like my mother and grandmother, politics falls on the back burner. Despite advancements in women's leadership and work, there still remains the creeping, silent factor of traditional gender roles and stereotypes that never seem to disappear entirely. These stereotypes encircle women and girls' everyday lives, shapes their expectations for themselves and for others, and as mentioned earlier, affects their self-confidence for even attempting action in the first place. All these factors may paint a picture, dark and depressing, of the state of political efficacy for women. But while every issue may have its dark sides and its downsides, hope is not lost. Far from it, as women are overcoming these factors that have previously affected women and more in older generations at neck-breaking speed. All I'm saying is there could be more. There could always be more representation, more things to be done in service of democracy that demands collective participation in order to remain a bastion of the free world. I leave you with the reminder of Plato. The heaviest penalty for declining to rule is to be ruled by someone inferior to yourself. If you refuse to participate in politics, you essentially submit to a lack of representation. You dig your own hole in the ground of how politically effective you could be. You, the mother, the sister, the daughter, the grandmother, have the power to break the cycle in your hands. So wield the power to vote, to believe in our great American democracy and its institutions, and to convince others to believe, even if it's just a little bit. To bring each other together in our own ways around the shared, interconnected fire of the American spirit. Thank you.